wrote on that delivery expedition. Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, Diane. Well, hello everyone. My name's Jamie Parker. I'm the member for the seat of Balmain. Many of you will know me because my office is on Glebe Point Road, and I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to their elders both past and present, and also the elders that are here today, in particular Auntie Wendy. Auntie Kathy, sorry. I don't know, I was just reading about Wendy here. I'm going to tell a story about that. There's something very important I want to talk to you about, and that is facts. And those facts are contained in a report. And that report was undertaken by this document here, the New South Wales Auditor General's report, the performance audit. It only came out a few weeks ago, and it describes in excruciating detail the fact that public housing, or what's now called social housing, is in absolute crisis. It's failing. In fact, it's already failed. So let's understand what we mean by social housing. There's about 119,000 public housing dwellings, about 27,000 social housing dwellings, which are run by non-government organisations, and about 5,500 Aboriginal Housing Corporation dwellings. That makes up the $35 billion worth of assets that are managed by the Land and Housing Corporation here in New South Wales. That's the organisation that manages all of the housing. Now, I'm just going to call it public housing because everyone knows what that means. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So how is it funded? How is the New South Wales Land and Housing Corporation funded? Well, it's funded by rents that tenants give, it's funded by all the other charges that tenants pay, and it's funded by grants. And what the Auditor General's report shows is the only way that the New South Wales Land and Housing Corporation can pay its way is by selling properties. Every year it's selling more and more of its assets in order just to fund its operational budget. And you can have a look at this report. The Auditor General slams this government, and in particular the last Labor government, for the disgraceful lack of financing for housing. And I'll give you an insight into how bad that is. When this new government took control in 2011, the average backlog in maintenance every year was over $300 million. $300 million. And why was that? Because the amount of money that's generated from rents and the lack of investment by the state government means they simply didn't have the funds. So every year we see it on the ground in our community. We see gutters that aren't fixed, fences that aren't fixed, things that are falling down, houses that are literally falling over. And what we also know is if you don't fix the gutter today, in 5 years' time, that's a wall that's disintegrating, that's falling over. Instead of costing $600 to fix the gutter, it's $16,000 to fix a wall. But that is a result of the lack of investment in public housing. There's a few reasons for that, and I'm going to be totally honest here. Number one, because a lot of public housing residents are not in the electoral roll. I'm being honest. I talk to my Liberal colleagues. As you know, there's 68 of them, for God's sake. It's a nightmare. There's 68 of them in the Parliament. They say, oh, we don't worry about public housing. They don't vote anyway. And if they do vote, they vote Labor. So we don't worry about it. And we know that in 1995, that was the beginning of the rot for public housing. Why is that? The Auditor General's report shows it very clearly. It shows, this is one of the best graphs actually, and I encourage you to get a copy of this, you can get it on the net, the growth in the number of social housing dwellings. It starts in 1945, 20,000 by 1955, 40,000 by 1965. The amount of public housing stock as a proportion of all of the stock in the state was basically the same from 1945, pretty similar levels, until when? 1995, then it crashed. There was almost no investment in public housing, very small amount of investment in public housing from 1995. Not just because the state government wasn't spending money, even though that's true, the Auditor General points it out, the amount of federal Commonwealth money coming to the states for public housing also reduced. But basically the tap was turned off in 1995, and the total amount of public housing built flatlined. There was a little bit of an increase in maintenance during the stimulus period when Rudd had all that money, they were spending all that money. There was a little bit of an increase in maintenance, but the stock of housing has basically declined quite dramatically as a proportion of all the housing. But what's increased? What's increased is the amount of people in urgent need. What's increased is the amount of people on the priority list. What's increased is rents going up and up and up and people not being able to afford to pay in the private market, so being pushed into the public market. So what we've seen is a conscious reduction in investment in public housing. We've seen a reduction in investment in maintenance. We've seen a reduction in the amount of capacity of the government to be able to provide public housing. And why? Because governments have not prioritised it. Now, housing. They're proposing fantastic housing. Single apartment housing, in particular for seniors, where there's a big demand. And this talks about it. Big demand for that. But what do they have to do in order to do that? Because the government isn't investing, they privatise 50% of it. They get 50% of it, the best half, chop it off, give it to private developers, sell it off to them. The best half of that land is going to private developers. More than half of the properties are private developers. The worst bit, stuck on the other end with the worst solar access, goes to public housing. And there's another building just for affordable housing, which means it'll be rented below market rent. So we put all the people with money in their own building, all the public housing tenants in their own building, and then some of the affordable housing tenants in their own building. It goes against everything that we know that works, which is mixing people together. Don't just have one huge building with all the public housing tenants. Have different people living in the same buildings, in the same communities. That's what makes place vibrant, and that's what makes Glebe so wonderful. Different people living in the community. That Cowper Street development it demonstrates everything that's wrong with a system where they don't invest. And people defend it and say, oh, it's great. We need to sell off land to pay for it. Well, no, we don't. We need to invest in housing. And the land is the most precious thing in the inner west. We don't have land. And as soon as you sell it to the developers, you can never get it back again. What we've been arguing for is, yes, let's develop that site. Let's make it all affordable housing. Let's make it all, which is just rented 20% below market rent. Let's make it public housing. But let's make it where there's a need, not just for $550,000 studio apartments. That is part of the reason why the private sector is failing, because it only delivers for those with money. And we can see it in Harold Park, $560,000 for a studio apartment. It's about this big. I couldn't lie down in it just about. And the last point I'll make is that what is the future for public housing? Well, it's about communities fighting together. Dennis, Julie, all of us working together. My office, all campaigning to make sure that we can highlight the maintenance needs and the selling off of public housing. We just saw another one just up the road here on Glebe Point Road. That beautiful house up there sold off a few weeks ago in excess of $1 million. One less house for people to live in. So what's the government's response? What's their response to this? You know what? The tenants can pay. The fact that we haven't invested in public housing, the fact that the wrong stock's been built, the fact that there's no maintenance, the tenants will pay. And how are they doing that? Number one, as you already know, if you're a single and you're living in a property that is the wrong size, they can't move you because there's nowhere to move you to. They'll say to you, oh, if you're a single, you can go over to the towers of Woolloomooloo. Go over there in Redfern, that's a good place for you to go. If you've got extra space, you've got to pay $20 a week more for that room. If you're a couple, you've got to pay $30 a week more for that room. So they're forcing people to leave their properties, their own communities, their social networks, to places where there is no accommodation and support, or inferior properties because they haven't invested. They haven't invested in public housing. And this report also prefigures what will be happening in public housing. And you know what it says? It says that the amount of rent that's generating is growing less fast than the cost of maintaining buildings. 25% of all the buildings in the public housing stock are over 40 years. They're more and more expensive to repair. So the cost is just going to get higher and higher. And so you know what they're proposing? Well, if you live in a well-to-do area, you should pay more. If you live out there in Western Sydney, the rents are so low. But if you live here in Glebe or in Potts Point or whatever, you should pay more. So that's what this report talks about. Why don't we consider differential rents? And there's another thing they're proposing is, let's say you pay 25% of your income, which is generally 25 to 30% of your income, depending what pension you're on. If you've got a 5-bedroom house, you pay 25%. If you've got a studio, you pay 25%. We know that's how it works. What they're proposing, if you've got a bigger house, you pay more. If you've got a smaller house, you might pay less. So what we're going to see is more and more pressure put on people, more and more costs put on tenants. Because why? Because the government hasn't invested, because they haven't got a strategy. And this report slams the New South Wales government, this new government, but more importantly, the former government, who for 16 years massively underinvested in housing. And what it says is that there's been no strategy, the departments haven't been talking to each other, there's been no investment, the buildings have been falling down, there's been corruption risk because of the selling of these properties. It talks about the risk of corruption. Over $1.5 billion worth of properties have been sold. And I'll leave on this point. Unless we continue to work with things like the Glebe Grapevine, and unless we continue to get government to make a noise, what this report says will happen. And what it says, in the next 4 years, more housing will be sold, will be privatised, than will be built. For the first time, they're going to be selling more housing than they are building housing, because they simply can't pay the bills, because the rents aren't enough, and it goes without saying that the Auditor General is not proposing that we actually invest in public housing. We actually create some jobs and get people building some things. It says that we shouldn't do that. It doesn't look at that. It looks at all the costs which can be pushed onto the tenant. So, we need to be working together. We need to be fighting for maintenance where it's due, and Dennis and a whole lot of other people have been working. Odessa, I know the Glebe Area Tenants Group has been fantastic that meets here, trying to push for maintenance, and we've got some increased money, 40 new roofs, we've got fences, you know, a roof can cost up to $50,000. We've got a lot of extra things done, but there's a systemic problem, the system's wrong. And that's what I'm fighting to change, that's what I'm working to change with you, and I hope that with your support we'll be able to make sure that we have a community where housing tenants are respected, where housing is seen as a right and not some kind of charity largesse that the government can pull away. And finally, we have a sustainable system, a system which will work in the long term and not just continue to cannibalise itself until it falls over. So thank you, and I look forward to working with you.